Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden with Camille Dungy. We are joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. This program tonight is co-sponsored by the Worcester Black History Project. I'm Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs here. The American Antiquarian Society is a national research library with the mission to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the printed and manuscript primary sources that are housed here. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. You can learn more about our programs on our website, and you can watch recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep our work going, and thank you. This evening's program relates to two themes featured in our public programming. One is our Nature and the Environment series, and you can see really great talks in that series on our YouTube channel. The other is our Artist in the Archive series, featuring creative and performing artists and writers who have worked with our collections for research and inspiration during the month-long fellowship. This is a fellowship program that the AAS has had in place for 28 years now, and you can see many of the impressive projects from those fellowships on our website. Our speaker this evening was one of those creative artist fellows back in 2005, and we are delighted to have her back with us this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce Camille Dungy. Camille Dungy's latest book, about which she will be speaking tonight, is Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden, published by Simon & Schuster just this month. Dungy is also the author of 4 collections of poetry, including Trophic Cascade, published by Wesleyan University Press in 2017, winner of the Colorado Book Award, Suck on the Marrow, winner of the 2011 American Book Award, and Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History, published by W.W. Norton in 2017, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Dungy's interest in the intersections between literature, environmental action, history, and culture led her to edit Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African-American Nature Poetry, published in 2009, the first anthology to bring African-American environmental poetry to national attention. She also co-edited From the Fish House, an anthology of poems that sing, rhyme, resound, syncopate, alliterate, and just plain sound great. And she is currently the poetry editor for Orion magazine. A university distinguished professor at Colorado State University, Dungy's further honors include the 2021 Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship, and 2 NAACP Image Award nominations and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts in both prose and poetry. She held a Hearst Foundation's Fellowship here at the American Antiquarian Society in 2005, where she conducted research for Suck on the Marrow, one of the many books I mentioned at the top. Professor Dungy, I will now turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nan. It's lovely to be here in this version of being together, and thanks for everybody who joins us this evening for this talk. I'm really excited to be able to chat with people who are connected with the American Antiquarian Society because, as Nan mentioned, I spent a month once wandering imaginatively through the holdings and being able to think about so many ways that the present is inflected by, shaped by the past, and to be grateful for places like the American Antiquarian Society that hold this record of who we've been, which help to shape an idea about who we might become. In my book, Soil, I have a moment where I say, no matter how many years have passed, no perennial in life's garden roots more deeply than history. And that sense of how the past stays with us in so many ways is one of the things that I want to talk about today. There's a figure in this book. So I'm talking about this book, Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden. The key to this collection is that I follow 7 years of my family's adventure in trying to diversify the landscape around us from the ground up and to convert our suburban monocultured yard from being mostly just river rock and grass to being a native garden that is a pollinator supporter and supports a lot of local wildlife and beneficial pollinators, and is also better for this Western environment where I live, which is a low water environment. I'm going to share my screen here, but just let the, you can just kind of let the slideshow move with you as background for what I'm talking about. Thomas Nuttall is the figure on whom I want to focus today. He shows up in the book about 3/4 of the way through as a named entity, but in fact, he lives all through this space and book for the whole time I've been here without my consciously knowing it. I learned about Nuttall through the rabbits in our yard, as well as the larkspur in the rock garden that grows in the shade of the neighbor's Norway maple, and the oxytrope I saw out the window as we drove home from Tennessee. Nuttall's cottontails, some call them, Silvolagus natalii. Nuttall's larkspur, Delphinium natalianum. Nuttall's oxytrope, Oxytropis multiceps. The former two named for him, not by him, to honor the wealth of Western American species Nuttall brought to the attention of England, Europe, and the relatively new settlers in the northeastern United States. In addition to gathering plants to distribute to collectors, Nuttall wrote, illustrated, and printed several catalogs of North American plants in the early decades of the 19th century. Let me tell you some of the plants named for or by Nuttall that live in my garden. I love the physical and sensorial dynamism these taxonomical common names point toward. Showy goldenrod, Solidago speciosa, Rudbeckia ampuxicalis, yellow-petaled flowers with elongated cone-shaped centers similar to, but not the same as the Retibida columnifera, commonly known as Mexican hat, that Nuttall also described and which is also in my garden. Penstemon albidus and Penstemon grandiflorus, flamboyant flowers waving like mini flags off tall stalks. Artemisia longifolia and Artemisia ludoviciana, two kinds of sage. Mentzelia multiflora, desert blazing star, and the Rocky Mountain iris, Iris missouriensis, I so deeply love. So Nuttall came to America. He was born in 1786, and he came to America in 1806 and fell in love immediately with the flora in particular in the US. And which was not, which was really new to him, a lot of the species he discovered. And he fell in with some key naturalists of the time and began to do some field work first in the Northeast, and then he moved into the Missouri River area as far as the Dakotas. And then in late 1811, as rumors of what became the War of 1812 showed up, Nuttall went back to England. But he caught the bug and couldn't stay away. And so he returned in 1825 and had a post at Harvard for several years and worked at Harvard until he got a little bored and wanted to dig deeper into the American interior. In that picture, you can see buried under the rhubarb bush, one of the cottontail rabbits who live in my yard. And it was really through that rabbit when I started doing research for soil to understand who my neighbors were and who lived around me. I started seeing that name, Nuttall, either in a parentheses after a taxonomical name, which suggested that he had been the first to identify the species, or either that Natali or Natalium name, so that somebody else had named the species for him. So he joined up with this man named Nathaniel Wyeth. And on that trip also were Townsend, who has a significant number of species named after him as well. And they traveled as part of one of these ventures to try and find new beaver trade. So there was this desire for wealth from the interior of the American continent, and attempts to try and find new passageways towards the Pacific Ocean to be able to bring these beaver pelts back. Nuttall had a really great time while he was doing that tour. He stayed on the West Coast or in the West for a significant amount of time, actually breaking off from Wyeth eventually. He traveled down the coast from Oregon all the way to California. And then he went out to what were then known as the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, stayed out there, identified a number of species in Hawaii. By some estimates, by the time Nuttall had completed all of this exploring and collecting in what was a relatively brief period of time, he had collected what could account for about 6% of the species in North America. He either identified himself or his name is part of the honorific in some way. 6% of the species on the North American continent are somehow connected by name and initial Euro-American identification to this man named Thomas Nuttall. And so as I was trying to think about what it meant for me to grow a native garden, as I was trying to understand what it meant for me as a Black woman in America to be honoring the species who are indigenous to this space and trying to create a space of care and reciprocal respect, I ended up thinking considerably about this legacy of naming, this legacy of exploration and quote unquote discovery. These two images here are from John J. Audubon's Birds of America, and they're birds that are named after Nuttall. And I think about and write about what complicated, difficult realities come along with looking out at this landscape, in engaging with the lives that have long been on this landscape, on which this space depends and on which people have been dependent for very long times, and kind of only seeing a particular kind of legacy. My favorite Thomas Nettle story happens in 1811. Only 25 and recently arrived from Yorkshire, England, Nettle embarked on an exploration of the Missouri River near the Dakota Territories, that immensely biodiverse region. In his book about garden plants, in which he said that almost every plant that we understand as a plant in the garden has some connection to Thomas Nettle. David Stewart recounts a story of how Nettle had a habit, according to one contemporary, of engaging himself with collection of plants to the total disregard of his own personal safety and sometimes the inconvenience of the parties that he accompanied. So on this particular trip, I'm writing about Nettle got lost, like truly lost, in a landscape a little bit like this. Don't look too far in the background of that picture because you'll see a campsite, and lost track of how to get back to his camp. And when he would be in these states, he would sometimes think he had so much wonderful, rich material that he gathered, but he also was missing some things. Nettle once wrote, "My botanical acquisitions on the prairies proved so interesting as I almost to make me forget my situation, cast away amidst the refuge of society without money, unprovided with every means of subsistence." But I know that he wasn't without every means of subsistence. I know that if he had had conversations with the people who lived in that landscape, if he had paid attention to the lives that lived in really honest and persistent connection with that landscape, that he would have found a great deal of other possibilities. The 1998 version of a book called Native American Ethnobotany catalogs 2 pages of uses for the common sunflower. There is at least one sunflower, by the way, with Nettle's name in it also. But in this giant reference book that was published in 1998, Moorman includes descriptions of how the people in the area where Nettle was when he said he was lost without any means of subsistence, Mandan people in that area powdered and boiled sunflower seeds to form cakes for portable food. But the 20th century naturalist's heavy cross-referenced 927-page volume required the invention and utilization of computerized database technologies unthinkable to Nettle. It also required that Moorman acknowledge and record indigenous wisdom and customs, something Nettle did not do. So I'm going to read just one more little section from this book that speaks to the ways that I'm trying to use the incredible knowledge and wealth of material and possibilities that Nettle helped open to so many new people, and combine that with a kind of consciousness for how to live in a more reciprocal and broadly aware manner. Via a recent shipment from an online nursery, I had 2 Solidago glutinosa starts, a species Thomas Nettle identified and named thanks to the Wyeth expedition. The nursery's catalog promised golden sprays of flowers from wand-shaped, short-branched arrays. After a spontaneous purchase at the local grocery store, I also had a gift-wrapped rust red and gold chrysanthemum. To give them space to grow into their full 24 inches. I sited the new plants carefully in the expanded 8 by 5 foot section at the center of our yard. I also spread a handful of tick-sized purple prairie clover seeds, Colorado bee plant seeds, and seeds from spiky echinacea pods, the size of the sweet gum balls that gathered around trees the autumn I lived in North Carolina and Virginia. Finally, I planted 36 orb-shaped bulbs, little blue wildflower tulips and Colorado proud tulips and the poet's daffodil. Soon the new patch looked like an island of soil and months from now dreams. White, yellow, orange, reddish pink, and ivory and black cherry blooms wouldn't manifest for 8 months, nearly as long as I waited to meet my daughter. Like the labor it took to bring my daughter into the world, many ministrations in this garden take time. I am often supplicant, begging the earth to provide what I need. Poor Nuttall, in 1841, was called back to England. His uncle, who was a self-made wealthy person with a printing company, passed away, and his will stipulated that Nuttall had to reside in England for 9 months out of the year. So after having identified all of these species, shared with so many people who were new to America and new to kind of thinking about these new landscapes, new to them landscapes in the American West, Nuttall had to go back to England. One time he tried to return and do a collection spree, but the 9-month stipulation was tricky. This one time he tried to come in September and return in March, but that still didn't give him enough time to make it all the way out to the American West. And even the distance he was able to go, things were dormant when he was around. And so he wasn't able to really have the joy of watching things in bloom. He produced a number of books, which I had fun thinking about and looking into. And as a printmaker, he was able to actually truly produce some of the books and make sure that his images that he had drawn were as lovely as possible. And he passed away in 1859 in his family's home outside of Liverpool, only able at that point to take shipments that other people sent him and not able to gather things on his own. So throughout my book, as I was thinking about digging deeply into history and the wonders of the American West and our botanically rich environment, this incredibly potentially diverse landscape that we have, I felt it was really, really useful to think about a person like Thomas Nuttall, who had been so responsible for helping to create an imagination and a true sense of what this world can and does look like. If we say that one of the things that literature does is help give us language for our imagination and a frame that helps us hold and see who we are and why, these kinds of dives into historical figures who have helped to shape our imagination, our sense of our landscape, our sense of ourselves, our sense of wonder and splendor is it's really exciting to me to be able to weave somebody like Nettle into the book, and also the complications of some of these historical figures and the ways that they represent shortcomings of imagination, even as they represent risk-taking and expansiveness, felt really exciting for me as a writer to be able to blend the historical narrative as related to Thomas Nettle's part of the story of American expansion and the vision of ourselves. So I think I'm gonna finish there and let Nan come back and chat with me a little bit and see where we go.
Thank you so much. That was really fun, and what a great book. It's such a pleasure to read it. And I want to encourage those of you who are joining us to put any questions you may have into the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to put your questions there, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. And yeah, I wanted to ask you, you were talking just a moment ago about weaving Nettle into your work, but I wanted to ask about the structure of the book. I love the way you've incorporated both photographs and poems into your work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the structure and how you came to incorporate both of them into this memoir, essentially.
Yeah, I want the book to feel like walking through my garden, and there are a variety of different patches. I have one little space that I call the dooryard that is full of these, it's got these hollyhocks that are just kind of wild and rambunctious and remind me of stories I've read about English dooryards with those kind of cottage gardens. And then I have a rock garden that has a number of Nettle's favorite. It has a big spread of Nettle's larkspur that goes all through it. And there is always a Nettle's cottontail rabbit that hangs out just by the Nettle's larkspur. And there's a big patch that's we call it the Prairie Project, but it's a large patch of removed lawn that we put in a pollinator garden with native gardens. And so you can walk around our yard and move into spaces that feel slightly different each time you go, but are all part of this whole concept that we had for renovating this space. And the book, I hope, also has that feeling where you'll move from space to space, medium to medium, essentially, that there's some memoir style prose and then there's poems. I have photographs, actually stylized photographs by a visual artist named Dion Lee. She took pictures that my daughter and I and another friend of ours took in the garden and made these timeless pieces from those. There was one black and white image in the slideshow of the delphinium of the Nettle's larkspur, and that's one of the examples of the images that Dion Lee made. I figured that one of the things when people wrote those guides to the American West, when he sort of sent back stories of what it meant to explore this region, they often would include drawings and other images so people could visualize some of what was being written about. And so I wanted that to be part of the book as well. So a true garden with a lot of different variety of plants, but also a lot of different ways of approaching and understanding the world.
Yeah, it really is fun to read for that reason, just the variety. And you do sort of feel that you're walking through, and I really love the way you've put it together. And
thank you.
You have questions coming in, so we'll bounce back and forth with questions. But there's a question about you're talking again about Nettle. C.M. Burroughs is asking, when did you realize you needed Nettle to tell your story? And at what point in your writing did you decide to widen the book's gaze?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that as I did a lot of research to ground the story, that word feels a little bit like I'm making a pun when I talk about grounding a story that's about my garden. But I want to think about how every decision that I make in my house and outside my house has a ripple effect through time and through my communities. And it helps me make those decisions if I know decisions that have been made before me and the ways that they've played out. So thinking about somebody like Nettle, who was so instrumental in helping to create this country's imagination of itself, felt like I couldn't really write a book that was trying to do that sort of work without speaking to that kind of legacy. Nettle walked not very far from here, from where I live. He didn't come all the way down to Fort Collins, where I live, but it's a half-day drive to the part of Wyoming, would have been Wyoming territory, through which they would have trekked. And so he saw landscape very, very similar to the landscape that I live in now. And it just felt fun to have a little time traveling in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of a line that really stuck out to me and I'm just going to read it. It's on page 41. We're talking about time, and you say, and I wrote it down because I thought, oh, I stand in the past and in the future when I stand in the present of our garden. That just sort of, to me, is some relates to what you're talking about, the sense of time, and that's what there's that movement in your writing, in your prose, that really comes to the present. It's very much about what's happening now. It's so present, and yet it's about the past as well. It's really quite fabulous.
And I think I can't fully understand. I don't think any of us can, but I can't fully understand what's happening now without understanding what has happened, right? Without understanding the legacies of colonial settlement, of what the mythologies around westward expansion and the core of discovery, and who got to claim their stake in this land and who was not allowed to do so. One of the pieces of information I discovered while writing and researching this book was that Colorado, and I write about this in Soil, but Colorado's territory, the kind of governors, controlling bodies of the territory, sent articles to create a state several times to Congress, and were denied several times, because even after the 14th and 15th Amendment, which were meant to grant men, native-born men in this country, which would include Black men, the right to vote, the original Colorado constitutions did not allow Black people, mixed race people, or Native men that right. And so that's one of the reasons that this, in many ways, incredibly free, open, accepting state took so long to be made a state, because kind of built into that history is these grand omissions for the welcome. And so writing in and trying to think about what it means to be today a Black family in a predominantly white town, why is that even the case, right? Why is this town still predominantly white in that way? And what are the ways that I can make sense to sometimes very welcoming reception and sometimes not, through a historical lens as well as through this really contemporary one.
Yeah. A question that Nell Painter has is about the writing for you. What was the writing like? Was it straightforward, lyrical, enticing, off-putting? And that may be a little bit about your process of writing, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Hello, Nell Painter. Thank you for being here. The writing, in some ways, this sort of journey of my life, I have been writing towards this book my whole writing career, writing towards investigating my deep connection and care about and for the greater than human world, and how being a Black person in this country in somewhat inflects the ways that is seen and experienced. And so writing that part of the book, I've been thinking through for many, many years. But some of the parts of the book were in the process of the drafting of the book in 2020 is when I did the bulk of the drafting of the book. And so my Nuttall discovery happened then. It happened in 2020. And it just he just kind of kept showing up in my garden as in the way that all those things are named after him. He keeps showing up in that way. His story kept interweaving with mine. And so I just, for me in the drafting, it's often a matter of letting in those surprising guests who keep knocking at my door and just seeing what stories they have to tell me.
And you were writing this during the you started this at the beginning of the pandemic. Am I right? That was the sort of...
Yeah. If you have read the book, you can see over on my left corner, there's that Guggenheim Memorial Foundation letter that I hung on the wall after decades of applying for a Guggenheim Memorial Foundation fellowship. I received one, and I was supposed to have the year of 2020 to dedicate to capital P poetry. And that seemed like a really exciting idea. And I took a leave of absence from my teaching job at Colorado State, and I was all set to write a book. And then everything closed down, and I was the one responsible for helping my daughter navigate the remote schooling, and everything changed. And it remained important for me to try and write this book. It just, the process slowed down considerably. And the book changed, that I found myself writing significantly more about this American sense that to be connected with nature, you have to leave your house and go away and be all by yourself and, trudge across vast landscapes in a kind of solitary fashion. And that wasn't going to work for me, because I was the one trying to get my daughter through the 4th and 5th grades, which happened to be years where there's a lot of American and particularly regional history taught. So I was right alongside my daughter, relearning these stories that are the ways that we construct our ideas about ourselves. And some of those stories made a lot of sense, and some of those stories felt like they could use some poking at and reconsidering. And so because of that, I had this opportunity to rethink what my project was going to be, and the kinds of truths and understandings that I could complicate and trouble in my own writing in ways that felt beneficial to creating a more sustainable landscape.
So Nicholas Mangan is asking, from your research, would you say that Nuttall's cataloging of American flora was still generally clouded by a colonial or consumptive view.
Absolutely. Yes. I could say more of that, but I write towards that in the book and what that feels like it means to me. A lot of just gathering, a kind of hoarding of resources that didn't necessarily speak to the ways that the people who had lived with these resources for millennia had used them, ways of thinking in a sustainable manner as opposed to simply just rapid harvesting, ways of understanding how to use a lot of these plants in particular. There's a sense that the wildflowers in my garden are useless, but most of them have nutritive value, nutritional value, medicinal value, in addition to being quite beautiful. And that kind of harvesting of resources simply to catalog or collect or move them to Europe or other places outside of their indigenous territory separates life from its meaning. And so part of my corrective that I'm not alone in this. I'm interested in aligning myself with a corrective that reconnects life with community, with meaning, with a kind of wider potential for thriving.
Yeah, that all really comes through beautifully in your work. Say, Lisa Mozinski is asking about whether, from your perspective, if Nuttall was a woman, how do you think his work would speak to us differently?
That's such a good question. So there's a new novel just out also this spring by a writer named Katie Smith, and the book is called Weeds. And it's about two female botanists over time through two different time periods who, because they're female botanists, are just the assistants. And so we don't have their records in history. And so Smith has imagined these women. And I recommend that book because I think she speaks a little bit towards this kind of question. Maybe I don't entirely know, because I don't know that just being a woman is enough to create a sense of interconnection and reciprocal esteem. But I think that the conditions in which women will often find themselves, where women are often in spaces where they're caretaking for children or elders or doing those other community works, means that we will sometimes look for different things in spaces, and we will find different strengths and practical purposes for the things that we do find in the world. So the brief answer is yes, I do think that it may have been different.
Another question here from Nell Painter has to do with the rabbits that you have talked about and that you write about. And I guess you just saw a Beatrix Potter show with her watercolors and her writing, and notes obviously that she was also attached to rabbits. Does she speak to you, Beatrix Potter?
Oh, I love Beatrix Potter. When my daughter was very, very little, a dear friend of mine who was also a writer gave us a little box set of many of the Beatrix Potter books. And, when every time my daughter kind of gets older and she outgrows one of those stages, and I'm like, but these books are so wonderful, because of the ways that Potter creates really full, true lives for these rabbits. Our yard rabbits, people who are gardeners ask if our yard rabbits don't make me crazy because they eat everything. In fact, they are pretty selective in what they eat. And again, it's often things that also have the name nettle inside their common or taxonomical names, which I find very interesting. It's almost as if these rabbits are saying, like, our great-great-grandparents used to tell stories about this particular buffalo rose, but we haven't seen it in this part for a long time, and then they just mow it to the ground. And so I've had to decide to either plant a lot more of certain things or plant them in places where they're higher and a little bit more difficult to access, or just share, which is sometimes what I do. It's been interesting learning to cohabitate with other lives in this space in ways that are not antagonistic.
And that's true for the weeds, the so-called weeds, that you're learning from them, I would say, maybe, and learning to use them.
A lot of the plants that I find incredibly beautiful in my garden that are native to this landscape, that work really well in this difficult climate, are identified as weeds by contemporary agricultural interests because they interfere with livestock, essentially. And so, or milkweed is another example. That milkweed for many, many years was villainized in American agricultural practices. I write in the book, there's a line where one of my daughter's friends' mothers came to the house and sees the milkweed that I have all over and says, I got rid of so much of that stuff when I was a kid on the farm, right? This kind of removal. And then we remove these things that are of this place, and then are surprised that the pretty butterflies that we really like aren't coming, but we've removed their sustenance, and or we remove the leaf litter too soon, and there's no place for the creatures to winter down and for their larvae to shelter. So I wanted to work in my garden and in my writing towards rethinking ideas about beauty, about what does and doesn't belong, about how things are supposed to look in particular kinds of settings and why. And the overlap between thinking about that in terms of what I grow outside and what it means to be a person of color in this country, in the ways that so frequently there are questions about who belongs where and when, and looking what way. Those became very quickly interwoven. And Nuttall himself, a little bit less problematic than some of his compatriots, but a lot of those early, mid 19th century American naturalists are completely wrapped up in and implicated in projects of removal and dismissal, subjugation and destruction of Indigenous people, Black people, Latinx people, not to mention a lot of animals and plants. And so that legacy of naming and claiming is directly connected with really destructive legacies in American history. And again, it feels important to me to acknowledge this, to speak about it, to talk about it, write about it, if we are to heal and take positive next forward steps.
Yeah, those legacies are so important to talk about. And I wonder if you could just elaborate just a bit for people, because most people haven't read the book because it's so new. But you do talk about John Muir, for instance. You talk about Thoreau. You want to talk about a little bit about some of those naturalists and those male writers that you do, again, kind of weave in and out of your narrative.
One of the things that I write about in Soil is an anthology I edited in 2009 called Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry. And when I conceived of this anthology, partially because one time I read some of my environmentally engaged poems at a big writers conference, and a person came up to me afterwards and said, I never thought about Black people writing about the natural world. Do you know more writers who do that? And in 18 months, start to finish, from getting the contract to publish the book to the book being out, I was able to collect an entire anthology's worth of writers, almost 100 writers doing this kind of work. So we've been there for 4 centuries worth of that work. We've been there doing that, but really problematic ideas about who engages with the greater than human world, who has pleasant interactions with the environment, who writes about nature. All of those things have been very, very limited for a very long time, partially because of the hagiographies that are built around writers like Thoreau and Muir and the Edward Abbey, these senses of writers, white male writers, who had the ability to spend some portion of their time out by themselves. One of the things that I find really confusing, honestly, about these men is they actually weren't ever by themselves. They always had communities around them who were supporting them in really, really key ways to be able to do the work they were doing. And I didn't understand, still don't understand, why those communities were erased. And so one of the reasons I understood that the Black writers had so frequently been left out of this canon is that because we will often write about community, and we will often engage other aspects of our lives interwoven with these environmental considerations. And so the way the canon had been established would shove that literature into some other section entirely and not into nature writing. And so I'm so glad that this book is like, that cover is so clearly like, this is nature. And also history, and also questioning pedagogy, and also thinking about social justice questions, and also thinking about our elections. All of those things can happen at once. So throughout the book, I kind of push against some of those gods of 19th and 20th century American literature, and ask a lot of whys throughout the book.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I will make sure that I get to everyone's questions here. Oh, we have one. Speaking of interacting with nature, this is a question that came in early on about your author photo. So I want to make sure this person, Catherine Gleason, is asking about whether you had your photo on East 6th Street. She thinks she knows that maple tree.
I don't know New York well enough to tell you the answer to that question. That photograph was taken in a community garden somewhere in New York, but I am not familiar enough to tell you.
That's great that she recognizes the tree. Here's one from Nicholas Megan. Did you have a specific intention behind planting a native flora garden at first. Was the specific inspiration behind it mainly reading about nettle, or was there other inspiration?
The planning came first. My knowledge of nettle came second. The real reason is that I moved to Colorado from California. California is a little bit like Eden. Like everything just grows. It's 72 degrees all the time. You can just throw seeds in the ground and out they come. The part of California where I live, there's other parts, but the part where I live was that. And then I came to Northern Colorado where it could snow still. Like it could still snow at this point, and it could snow as early as Labor Day when it's fall again. The climate can be really unfriendly and unpredictable. But native plants understand this climate. Native plants understand how to live in a low water place, so I can have a low water garden. And native plants support local pollinators. And if I want to be part of repairing the harm that 2 centuries of human action, industrial revolution action has taken, I need to be able to support pollinators and local flora and fauna as well. And so that's really, it was a ideological decision to have a native low water garden. And also it's honestly easier, surprisingly, because of our climate.
And you were born in Colorado too, am I right?
I was born in Colorado, and so there is a little part of my magnetic center that is happy here. I was born in Colorado. My mother's best friend lived here my whole life, and so I came to visit. And also, I don't just write about like other people's history. I also think a little about my own family history throughout soil. And I had a great uncle who attended Colorado A&M, which is now Colorado State University, where I am a professor. And so I didn't ever come visit him here, but there's this kind of longer family connection to this space also.
Yeah, nice. Well, we're getting close on time. There's one other quote that early on in your book I jotted down, which is that every politically engaged person should have a garden. I love that. And I don't know.
And I think with this whole conversation, just the way that looking at my garden and really truly engaging with my garden helps me understand some key aspects of my history and our collective history that I don't know that I would have had the entry into that knowledge about who I am and who we are without spending the time I spent in this garden. And so that's one of the many reasons I think that gardens with which we deeply engage can help us be deeper.
Well, it's a great book, and I hope that people will read it. It's well worth the read. We are just about out of time. I first want to thank you for a really wonderful presentation and discussion and answering these questions. It's really been wonderful to have you with us and to have you back, even if not in person, but to have you essentially back here at AAS, even virtually. And we hope that you will come back.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. And I have to say, that I did so much of this book during 2020, so there was no going there, but your virtual collections are also the digitized collections are not something I had access to in 2003, but more people can access more of the American Antiquarian Society's holdings now than ever before. And so thank you for that. Those images, those John Audubon images of the nettles were from your collection, actually. So
yes, no, thank you for pointing that out. The digital collections are really quite useful for a lot of people who can't get to us. So it's great for people to recognize that. I do want to let everyone know about a couple of upcoming programs on Thursday of this week at 2 p.m. Katie McGettigan will be presenting on her book, The Transatlantic Materials of American Literature, Publishing U.S. Writing in Britain, 1830 to 1860. That is part of our book talk series. And on June 6th at 7 p.m., we will host a hybrid program. That is, we will be in person here at the library in Antiquarian Hall, but also virtually with Alex Krieger in conversation with Ed Augustus and Scott Casper about Krieger's book, City on a Hill, Urban Idealism in America from the Puritans to the Present. So I hope all of you will be able to come back and join us for those programs. We thank you all for joining us. And Camille, what a delight to have you with us. And we hope again that you'll get here in person soon. And good luck with the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone.